Hi, Erin.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Good. Were you able to get your phone figured out or?
It so right when you called, it dropped down to 1 bar, and then it was out for like 45 minutes, and now it's back up to 3 bars. So it kind of ish works, but who knows? I think it's a Verizon issue, so not much I can do about it.
Where in Texas are you?
I'm in Dallas.
You guys aren't having weather, are you? Or
No, it's I mean it's hot. It's very, very hot, but other than that, we're good.
gotcha. All right. Well, I just thought I'd jump on early.
Perfect. Well, I'm gonna stick myself on mute and go grab some water. But Ryan should be joining early as well, and then we'll just get started. I'll let you kick it off at the top of the hour whenever you want to kick it off.
Okay.
The intro, and then I'll take it from there. So
Great. Thanks, Natalie.
perfect. Yeah, have a good one.
Is it cool if I hang out here or should I come back?
You're fine. You're just going to see the internal workings of getting a Zoom training ready. So you're fine.
Oh, I'm all aware. Good luck.
I figured anyone who was joining would be aware of what it takes, right?
Yes. I'm sure it'll be fantastic once it gets going.
Thanks, Andre.
Thanks.
Hello, Natalie. And company.
Yeah, I think we've got a handful that have joined, and Abby and
Oh,
Aaron,
lovely.
Aaron are on as well.
Lovely.
Hi, Ryan. How are you?
Hello, doing well. Very backlit right now. I apologize. Let me.
That's all right. I'm going to give everyone a few more. I am going to give everyone a few more minutes to jump on, and then we will get started. Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're going to get started, and I am so excited to see so many different people join us for this training. My name is Erin Casey, and I'm with State Voices, and we are working with the Charge Coalition and are excited to be hosting Boulder Advocacy to be able to talk to all of you about rules of the road for C3s, C4s, and other tax entities and how they can engage in redistricting. We have two speakers from Boulder Advocacy, Abby and Natalie, who will be helping to both walk us through this training, walk through a couple of scenarios, and then be able to answer questions directly from all of you who are in the field doing this work. This training will be recorded, and I will be sending out an email of the recording afterwards for anyone who wants to refer back to it and be able to go back to the slides. So thank you everyone for joining us. I would ask that we have so many people on the call right now. Please just put your name and organization in the chat box so we can see who's here. And I'm going to hand it over to Natalie and Abby. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction, Erin. Hopefully everyone can hear me loud and clear and see the slide presentation that's up on the screen currently. My name is Natalie Austin Ford. I am the Texas director of a nonprofit organization called Alliance for Justice. I will be joined today by the director of Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy Program, Abby Levine. Abby is going to be monitoring the chat, so feel free to drop any questions you have there, and she can answer some of them as we go and hold some of them towards the end, but definitely feel free to engage in a dialogue with us as we go through this content, because we really want to make sure that you understand as advocates, as nonprofit leaders, what you can be doing during the redistricting process, particularly in compliance with perhaps your 501c3 status, maybe your 501c4 status, or some other type of tax exempt entity. So that's what we're going to be discussing for the next hour and a half. We're going to talk about redistricting. We're going to talk about some legal tips for nonprofit advocates and then discuss some different scenarios in this context. Now, before we get to that, I do want to mention just a little bit about Alliance for Justice and what we do. Alliance for Justice is a nonprofit organization itself, a 501c3 public charity. We're actually a national association of more than 120 organizations that are all committed to progressive values and to the creation of an equal, just, and free society. And we are advocates for the federal judiciary. And more specifically, we want to see a federal judiciary that advances core constitutional values and the even-handed administration of justice for all Americans equally. We are also a leader in the rules that apply to nonprofit advocacy and also in advocacy capacity building. And we do that through a program that we call our Boulder Advocacy Program. Now, Boulder Advocacy, we have our own website for this program, so you can go to boulderadvocacy.org. On that website, you are going to find hundreds of free written legal resources to help you understand what you can be doing as a 501c3, as a 501c4. We also have a brand new podcast. If you want to nerd out with us a little bit, every other week we have a new episode and we talk about different topics that are affecting nonprofits and how they can advocate around those topics. And then, of course, we have free technical assistance for any nonprofit of any shape, any size. So again, I definitely encourage you to ask your questions, to drop them in the chat as we go through this content. But the good news is that if you walk away after this session and realize, whoops, forgot to ask something that I wish I would have asked, you can reach out to us for free technical assistance 5 days a week. And we have a lawyer on staff who will be ready and able to help you answer those questions. So that's a follow-up service that is free to any nonprofit of any shape, any size in the US. Here is our technical assistance hotline information. If you want to email your question, you can send it directly to advocacy@afj.org. You can also reach out to us on the phone by calling 866 NP Lobby. And we also have a technical assistance submission form on our website. So 3 different ways that you can get in touch. But again, happy to answer your questions during this presentation. Just wanted to make sure that you also knew about this free service in case you want to follow up with something next week or a few months down the road. So lots of resources here available for you all. Excited to talk to you today about redistricting. One disclaimer that we do have to issue before all of these trainings is that even though I am a lawyer, even though Abby is a lawyer, we are not your lawyer, unfortunately. So we can't offer any legal advice. If you find yourself having to defend yourself in court at any point in time, we aren't unfortunately going to be the ones that are going to be able to represent you. With that said, we are here to help you navigate these rules, to help you spot the red flags, to help you really understand what your boundaries are as a nonprofit so that you can do as much as possible in the advocacy space without running afoul of some sort of obscure rule that you may not have known existed. We're also here to help you build your advocacy capacity, and we have several tools that can help with that as well. So that's our little introduction. Abby, did I miss anything, or is there anything you wanted to say before we get started here?
No, you got it all. I will just say I did put in the chat box a link to our basic fact sheet on redistricting, much of which Natalie will talk about and more today. But if you're looking for something to hold in your hands right after this webinar or something that you can send to coalition partners, that is some of the basics.
Perfect. Thank you for doing that. And again, Abby will be monitoring that chat, so feel free to drop your questions there. But again, just a little bit of an agenda before we get started so that we all know where this presentation is going. We are going to start with some basic rules that apply to 501c3s, 501c4s. The bulk of our conversation is really going to be focused on C3s because they have the most restrictive rules, but we will also touch on the C4, C5, C6 rules as well, just so that you understand the scope of what you can do and perhaps what your coalition partners can do as well. We're then going to talk about lobbying. The reason being is that when you look at the redistricting process, in some instances, it does require you to lobby as a nonprofit if you want to speak out about how boundaries should be drawn, for example. So we'll talk about how to determine what types of activities qualify as lobbying and which might be non-lobbying activities. We're then going to talk about how to, as a 501c3 in particular, how to keep your redistricting advocacy nonpartisan. Because again, as 501c3s, we have restrictions that prohibit us from engaging in partisan electioneering. So we'll talk about what that means. And since redistricting is so very deeply tied to elections, it's one of these situations where that's always got to be at the front of your mind. You've always got to be thinking about whether you are trying to advance some partisan objective or not. And of course, as a C3, you hope that you are not. We'll talk a little bit about private foundation funding and public foundation funding a little bit. Oftentimes funders will fund lobbying. Sometimes they won't. They obviously won't fund partisan election activities. So that will be relevant as well. But we'll talk about how you can talk to your funders about your redistricting work and what you can do within the scope of your grant agreements. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with some scenarios from the field. So we've got 4 different scenarios that we've come up with that'll kind of walk through some real world examples of partnerships that you might be approached with, of methods that you might be approached with, and how those can play out, whether they're lobbying, whether they're not, and how to keep them nonpartisan. And then of course, some Q&A at the end. We'll leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A, but again, if a question comes up in the chat in the meantime, Abby might chime in at any point in time to raise that question with the group, because we want to make sure that you're getting out of this presentation everything that you need. So that's our agenda for today. So again, first topic of discussion are the basics. What are the basic rules that apply to 501c3s? And particularly in the redistricting process. So when we talk about 501c3s today, we're really going to be talking about public charities. And I mention that because, of course, private foundations are another type of 501c3, but they have more restrictive rules. And so generally speaking, when we're talking about C3s, we'll be talking about public charities today. But these are organizations like Alliance for Justice, the organization that I work for, that Abby works for. They are tax exempt organizations. And the unique thing about them, one of the unique things, is that they receive tax deductible contributions. And so there's this incentive for donors to give to this type of organization. But in exchange for that incredibly favorable tax treatment, there are going to be some limits placed on what they can do in regards to advocacy. And specifically, those limits come in the areas of lobbying and electoral activities. So the good news is that in terms of lobbying, 501c3 public charities are allowed to lobby as long as they stay within some lobbying limits. So, they can't spend their entire budget on lobbying, but they can do a limited amount of it. The one thing they're not allowed to do, though, is they are not allowed to support or oppose candidates for public office, which effectively means that everything that 501c3s do has to be nonpartisan. So that will be very important during this redistricting discussion. Now, that's a little bit different than the rules that apply to 501c4, social welfare organizations, 501c5s, 501c6s, talking about things like unions and trade associations. They are also tax exempt organizations, but they don't receive those tax deductible contributions. And so they actually have more flexibility in terms of what they are allowed to do with their advocacy. And so with the lobbying piece that will become very relevant in this redistricting discussion, they can do an unlimited amount of lobbying. If they want to spend 100% of their budget on lobbying, they are permitted to do that as C4s, C5s, and C6s. They are also allowed to do some partisan electoral activity as long as it's a secondary activity of their organization and not the primary activity. So the primary activity could be something like lobbying, for example. Now, if you go further down the spectrum, you have tax exempt organizations like PACs, which are groups like Emily's List, for example. Again, tax exempt entities. They don't receive tax deductible contributions, and they exist almost primarily to influence the outcome of candidate elections. And so different types of groups have different rules that apply to them. So always be clear which hat you're wearing if you're representing a C3 or a C4, because those rules are going to follow you into any coalition work you're doing, into any individual work you're doing as an organization. But again, the good news for C3 public charities is that there is a role for you in the redistricting process, as long as you stay within your lobbying limits and know which of your activities qualify as lobbying, and as long as you don't engage in any partisan electoral activities. So to put that another way, when we talk about advocacy for 501c3s, we have a lot of different options. We mentioned those lobbying limits. And so there's, 501c3 public charities are allowed to do a limited amount of lobbying. And if you make what's called the 501h election, that might sound familiar if some of you have been on our trainings before, it can be up to 20% of your budget in some cases. So there are ways to maximize that limit, but you do have to stay within lobbying limits as a 501c3. Your red light, of course, is that partisan political activity. So there's no support or opposition for candidates for public office. That's kind of a hard line stop for 501c3 public charities, but every other type of advocacy, whether it's administrative advocacy to agencies, whether it's training people on how to get involved in advocacy, nonpartisan voter education, community organizing, there's no limits that the tax code places on that type of advocacy in the tax code. And so again, lots of different options, even for 501c3 public charities that have the most restrictive advocacy rules in terms of what they can and can't do in the lobbying and election space. So that's our basic overview and gets us through that first agenda point. The second agenda point is really this question of, when your activities are going to qualify as lobbying, right? Because if you engage in lobbying as a 501c3 public charity, then you have to stay within certain lobbying limits. And so what is lobbying? Well, it really is going to depend on how your 501c3 public charity measures its lobbying limits. So if you measure your lobbying limits with what's called the insubstantial part test, and this incidentally is the default test that applies to all 501c3 public charities as soon as they are created. But if you are under that test as a 501c3 public charity, this definition set that you see on your screen is what's going to apply. So it's contacting legislators to propose, support, or oppose legislation or the government's budget process. It's urging the public to contact their legislators to propose, support, or oppose legislation or the budget process. And it's advocating for the adoption or rejection of legislation. So that's pretty broad. And effectively, anything that you do that is in support of or in opposition to legislation that's engaged in that legislative process, maybe to get a bill passed, maybe to get certain boundaries passed during the redistricting process, if that goes through a legislative body, that's all going to count as lobbying if you're under that insubstantial part test. Now, the alternative test for 501c3 public charities, not including churches, religious organizations, religious institutions, but other types of 501c3 public charities, is called the 501h test. And under that 501h test, again, this is an optional test that some organizations have chosen, have opted into using. But under that test, not only do you get more generous lobbying limits, sometimes up to 20% of your budget, but you also get narrower definitions for what qualify as lobbying or for what qualifies as lobbying. And under that test, there are two different types of lobbying. There's what's called direct lobbying and what's called grassroots lobbying. Direct lobbying would be communication with a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation. And grassroots lobbying would be communication to a different audience, so in this case to the general public, that expresses a view about specific legislation and has what's called a call to action. So we have two different definition sets here. In terms of direct lobbying, in terms of what qualifies as a communication, it could really be any type of communication. So whether that's an email to a legislator, maybe it's a tweet at your senator, that would be a communication to a legislator. But that's a pretty broad term. But in terms of who qualifies as a legislator, what I want to point out is that it does include legislators at all levels of government. So if you are working with local legislative bodies during the redistricting process, that would be considered communication with a legislator. If you're working maybe with state legislative bodies, state level. So for example, I'm in Texas, so the Texas House of Representatives or the Texas Senate, that would be considered communication with a legislator. And then, of course, it's also going to include people like the governor People like the president, for example, maybe your local mayor, if you are asking them to intervene in the legislative process. And I'll explain why that becomes a little relevant later. But so, for example, let's say that a bill passes or some boundaries get passed in terms of mapping and redistricting, and you want the governor to veto because you don't think they're fair. Or maybe you want the governor to sign. You're asking the governor to step into that legislative process. And so in those limited situations, that would be considered communication with a legislator, even though you're communicating with a member of the executive branch. So a narrow little exception, but can become relevant when we talk about some different scenarios and examples later on. Of course,
Natalie,
yeah.
You may get into this more in detail, but one question that came in, which is a great question, is specifically talking about redistricting. But what if the redistricting lines go through the legislature for final approval, but are created by commissioners? With as you were just talking about executive branch officials, how would commissioners, redistricting commissioners fit in?
And that's actually a great teaser for one of the examples we're going to have coming up here in a minute that I screen grabbed from a group that's dealing with that exact situation. I think it was Maryland that does that, in addition to other states as well. But, if that commission is having a role in the legislative process, if ultimately the legislative body has to sign off on it, in other words, it has to get legislative approval in order to move forward, then it is quite possible that you are engaged in a lobbying communication and commenting about specific legislation, because you are helping and assisting that body as part of an ultimately legislative process. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more detail about that here in a minute, but that's a great teaser for the time being. So again, direct lobbying, communication with a legislator, understanding that legislators can sometimes include non-legislators, as frustrating as that is, that expresses a view about specific legislation. That last prong is going to be really important as well. So specific legislation can be anything from a bill that's been introduced. It could be asking someone to put specific language in a bill or into a piece of legislation. So asking them to draw boundaries in a certain way, for example. It could be asking someone to sponsor a piece of legislation or not sponsor a piece of legislation, nominations that require Senate confirmation, things like that, and then specific legislative proposals. So if you have a bright idea for a piece of legislation, even if it's not ultimately adopted, even if it's not ultimately created and made into law, you making that specific legislative proposal to a legislator, communicating that to a legislator, could be considered a lobbying communication. So that's direct lobbying. Grassroots lobbying, on the other hand, you have a different audience. You still have to have that communication, which again, still pretty broadly defined. The audience is different because you're not communicating to legislators, you're communicating to the general public. So maybe through a Facebook post, a tweet, maybe you're writing an op-ed in the newspaper. Those would all be communications to the general public. Still has to express a view about specific legislation, but it's not going to be considered a grassroots lobbying communication if you've made that 501H election, right? Unless you have a call to action. And the very short definition for a call to action is basically it's encouraging the public to communicate with their legislators. So something like telling the public to contact their legislators to express support about a piece of legislation or opposition to, providing them with contact information for legislators, providing them with a mechanism to communicate with legislators. You see that a lot now where you have the form on the organization website. And if I go and I type in my name and my zip code, it will auto-generate a letter to my legislator. That would be a mechanism of grassroots lobbying communication. And then finally, naming legislators in a kind of more passive way who might be on the fence about a piece of legislation. So if you have something in a committee hearing, for example, you've got your legislators that are clearly in favor of these boundaries, you've got your legislators that are clearly opposed, but then you have this persuadable group in the middle. If you name those legislators, that's going to be considered an indirect call to action as well. So with that, we kind of know the definitions now. Well, how does this apply to redistricting? And I think that question that Abby raised a minute ago is a really good one, because it really depends on the exact process that your state is using, or the state that you want to engage in. And so I've just picked a couple of examples here to kind of walk through some of the differences. But the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to investigate the process in your state to figure out if there is any legislative work that is involved in it. So for example, I am in Dallas, Texas. I run the Texas office at Alliance for Justice. Our redistricting process is almost entirely legislative. In fact, the governor just, I think yesterday, announced that he'd be calling a third special session because, our first two weren't enough, right? Yeah, so now we've got a third one coming up. Lots of bad bills that we're going to have to be working on, but it's also going to be a redistricting special session. And so in Texas, this is a very simplified version of what happens here. You can go into a lot more depth at a later date. But in Texas, the redistricting bills basically follow the same path through the legislature as other type of bills. Normally this is something that would have been taken up during a regular session in Texas, but because of timing with the census data and everything else, it's going to come up in a special session. And ultimately, both houses will need to approve the boundaries that are drawn, approve the redistricting bills. Those bills then get presented to the governor. The governor can then, of course, sign the bill or veto the bill. But if the bill fails to pass, then it would go to a legislative redistricting board. But primarily, this is a legislative process in Texas. And so if we are communicating directly with legislators about how to draw those boundaries, for example, we're probably engaged in a lobbying communication under either the 501H or in substantial part definitions. Now, that's Texas. It's mostly a legislative process. There are other states. So for example, Michigan, where it's more of a citizen-driven process, a commission-driven process, and not a legislative one. So in Michigan, they just recently created what's called the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. It is a citizen-led commission that manages the entire redistricting process. It was created with the idea that it would help remove politicians from this process because they have a vested interest in how things go. And they are required as a commission to solicit input from the public, to draw the boundaries in accordance with federal and state laws. But effectively, this is a citizen-driven, commission-based process as opposed to a strictly legislative one. So very different ways that these two states go about the redistricting process. And just one illustration of why you as an advocate need to figure out which state you're working in and what their particular processes are, because that's going to be unique to every single state. So how can your nonprofit participate? Well, of course, public charities can engage in a limited amount of lobbying, but they can also do an unlimited amount of non-lobbying advocacy as long as it's done in a nonpartisan way. So not designed to influence the outcome of candidate elections. So for example, you could educate elected officials or commissioners about social issues that impact your communities. So for example, talking about how districts might unfairly divide different communities, or how current district lines might force community members to take long bus rides to participate in the public hearing processes, that type of thing. You could also analyze census data, which came out recently, and provide an analysis of how the population has shifted in your state, how it has grown, how it has decreased, depending on what the situation is. You can attend public redistricting hearings. Those might take place in front of a citizen-based commission like in Michigan, or they might take place at the legislature like in Texas. But either way, as long as you're staying within your lobbying limits, if it's a lobbying communication, you can provide testimony about how different boundaries might affect the communities that you serve. And then of course, you could even potentially draft maps or comment on maps that have been drafted by others during this process. And you could comment on the approval and evaluation of those maps. Again, as long as you do so in a nonpartisan way. And we're going to talk about what that means here in a bit. And so don't worry too much or too heavily about that at this moment. But again, lots of different ways that you can get involved, both legislatively and perhaps in front of a commission. So here we have a few examples. We're going to test Abby's knowledge of the rules here, which is, it's going to be fun and exciting because she's my boss and knows them a lot better than me. But here we go. So we got this is actually it's a coalition, Abby, in Pennsylvania, and they call themselves Fair Districts PA. Bunch of different groups that have joined this. And in 2011, this is what their tweet says, posted on September 6th. In 2011, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a congressional map. And they talk about how it was not given much time for public review. Don't let that happen again. Give testimony, ask for time to see and comment on the proposed maps. Maps matter. We need fair maps for all. And then of course, the article that they link to is kind of a newspaper article type thing. And it talks about how they don't want lawmakers to tear apart these specific communities within the Lehigh Valley. So the question becomes, is it lobbying? Does this communication need to count against the organization's lobbying limits? Any thoughts on that, Abby?
So first of all, it's a tweet, so it would be a communication to the public. So we would want to start with, it would be whether it's grassroots lobbying. So it's a communication to the public. It's asking people, there's a call to action, asking people to contact their legislators, but is it expressing a view about specific legislation? And here, and somebody just put in the chat box, initial thought, no, because it doesn't name a specific bill. And so it does not name a bill. It does say, the legislature passed a congressional map, and this group is sort of implying that it doesn't love that map. So I could read this in one of two ways. One, that this would be encouraging people to weigh in and say, stop the process. We don't like the bill that's sort of pending, that's been passed, and let's do something over. Or it could be asking people to just to provide comments on what a map should look like. But so I'm not sure there's specific legislation. And so I guess I'm not sure that I know enough information of whether there's specific legislation that we're weighing in on.
So one thing that I would recommend there is, we oftentimes talk about what we call the one-click rule in terms of online communications. And what's unique about this particular tweet is that it's not just words and a picture, it actually links to an article. So it might be that if you go to that article, that it becomes a lot more clear whether this is in support of or in opposition to a piece, whether it expresses a view about specific legislation. The other unique thing to think about, though, is that, Abby mentioned, is it grassroots lobbying? Obviously, this is to the general public, so it may or may not be. This is kind of one of those ones that's on the fence. But the benefit of making that 501H election, so if you're one of the groups that's actually in the position of determining whether this is grassroots lobbying or not, is that it's an expense-based test, which means that really all that's relevant is how much you spend on the communication. That's all that needs to count against your lobbying limit. And so a tweet like this that may have just taken you, 30 seconds to draft and click post, there's not really much there in terms of an expense anyway. So, it might not be too problematic to just go ahead and post it and not worry about it. But if you want to defer on the side of the caution, bill that 30 seconds to your grassroots lobbying. It's not going to take too much out of your budget and can be a very effective way to mobilize people to speak out about this process of redistricting. So that was a tricky one. Let's go to another one. This is, again, I'm in Texas, so I'm going to use some Texas examples today. But it says, we want fair maps, y'all. And it says, calling all Texans, join Move Texas, the Texas Civil Rights Project, Common Cause Texas, Deeds Not Words, Children's Defense Fund, Mi Familia Vota, and Next Gen in mobilizing for the redistricting process. I read that out because for those of you who don't know all of these groups, a lot of these groups have C3 and C4 arms. Some of them are specifically C3, some of them are specifically C4. So this is a blended coalition here. And it says the time has come to draw new electoral maps for our state. A few weeks ago, the Census Bureau released the results of the 2020 census, confirming what we knew to be true. Texas is increasingly younger and more diverse than ever. Help us fight for fair maps by registering for a virtual youth redistricting advocacy day on September 8th. This is an opportunity to learn more about the redistricting process and how you can get involved in the next 10 years for political power. So it's an invitation to attend kind of a workshop training discussion about how you can potentially get involved in the redistricting process. Do we think this is lobbying? Go ahead, if you have any thoughts, drop them in the chat, but then we're going to kick it over to Abby for her analysis. Any thoughts, Abby?
I agree with all these people in the chat who've been responding in the chat box that this would not be lobbying, that this is not talking about or weighing in on a specific map, but this is really trying to get people engaged.
Right, and that would be my sense too, is this is more about informing people about how the process works and how they could potentially get involved, not trying to sway specific boundaries or influencing the exact language that's in those redistricting bills. So I do
now,
not
just to weigh in, one other question that came in that relates to this was somebody asked, would organizing certain groups to submit testimony be counted as lobbying? And I think this example shows that our answer as to so many things is it depends. That if you're organizing groups to submit testimony to respond to or to critique a particular map, that very well could be lobbying. But if you're instead organizing people to say, there is a process going on, the legislature needs to hear from people, weigh in and tell them what you think, then that very likely is not lobbying.
It really comes down to that, whether you're expressing a view on specific legislation or advocating for the adoption or rejection of legislation. So this on its face, I don't think counts as lobbying. There's a possibility that, if I log into this training and they start telling me to call my legislators to express opposition to certain types of maps, that might be a different scenario, right? But this initial advertisement here does not appear to include a lobbying communication. We have one more example on this is it lobbying train of thought. This is from
actually, Natalie, before you do that, one other question that came in. And normally, if we were doing a full lobbying training, we would talk more about some of the exceptions of what counts as lobbying, what doesn't. But we're not here. But if you want more information about lobbying, reach out to us. But somebody said, which is a great question, particularly with redistricting. So if it's a legislative redistricting process, but the legislators have a requirement, or they've said, we want to hear public input. And so they've sort of encouraged people to provide public input. The question is it lobbying? And as we often talk about, that there is an exception that if you are invited to provide testimony, it won't count as lobbying. But the catch with that exception is that the invitation needs to be made to your organization individually, or particularly that where the legislature is inviting your organization to submit comments, not that it's making a request for public comments. So even though the legislature has an open hearing process where they do want to hear from organizations, if the group goes to weigh in, it does count as lobbying. But as Natalie reminded us, and as somebody was asking about in the chat box as well, one of the great things about the 501H expenditure test is that it only looks at expenditures. And so if you have a staff person who goes to testify, or the staff person who writes talking points for their network, that might count as lobbying. But if you put something out to your network and you have individual members who choose to go testify on their own, that won't count against your organization's lobbying limits. And lots more info on the lobbying rules, but I'll turn it back to you.
I would say it won't count against your limits unless you pay them, right? Or reimburse them, right? But if they're truly volunteers and you're just encouraging people to write to their legislators or to show up, yeah, that's the distinction there. And that exception that Abby was talking about is called technical assistance, if you're looking for it at any point in time or trying to dig through kind of the tax law. But again, it does require a formal written invitation from the legislative body to come testify. So usually it would come from a committee chair, for example. They send you a written invitation to weigh in because you are an expert in the field, for example. And then you go and you testify, and you don't have to count that against your lobbying limits if you get that formal written invitation. But we have one more example. This here is from the League of Women Voters of Maryland. And what they say is citizens should have a voice in the redistricting process. Otherwise, it's just the people in power telling us who we get to vote for. This is our chance in Maryland for the people to actually propose fair maps for all. And then they talk about and they link to another Twitter account called Maryland Matters. And it talks about how this is going to the Citizens Redistricting Commission, which might immediately make you think of that Michigan example that we were talking about earlier. This is a citizen-based commission. But then if you go to the commission's website and you actually start digging through the Maryland websites about how the process works, what you find out is that Maryland, like all states, have to draw new congressional districts every 10 years. The redistricting process begins with the census count and the delivery of that data to the states the following year. And then it says once the state receives that census data, the Maryland Citizens Redistricting Commission can review the findings, hold public hearings, receive third-party plans. The commission then provides its proposed congressional and legislative plans to the governor, who will then submit his plans to the Maryland General Assembly as bills for passage into law. The new districts are then adopted by the General Assembly, which is the legislative body, and signed into law by the governor. So this is one of those instances where we have a commission that basically makes recommendations to the governor, that then sends that recommendation to the legislature, but ultimately the decision is the legislator's decision and then the signature of the governor. So it's a kind of a blended process, much like the example that I think was raised in the chat earlier. So with that in mind, what do we think? You know, Abby, do you have any thoughts on whether this post might be lobbying? And so it just says that citizens should have a voice. Otherwise, it's just the people in power telling us who we get to vote for. This is our chance. So is
this post by itself? No, because it may be encouraging people to get involved, but it's not talking about a particular map. So there's no specific legislation. And then for people responding, if somebody creates a map and sends it directly to, or criteria that they want the map to be, and send that and submit that to the commission, it very well likely is lobbying. But on the other hand, if the group has used the 501h expenditure test, if the group writes an op-ed, so a communication to the public, or creates a white paper that they put on their website and sort of lay out what they think the criteria should be, and so it's a communication to the public, if there's no call to action, it may not be lobbying. So the organizations could actually be, there could be ways that an organization in Maryland could comment on what they want to do or what they think the maps should look like, and it still won't be lobbying.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think I agree. I picked this example because it seemed to me that despite the complicated process, at least this tweet is not a lobbying tweet.
And just a question that just came in. So in some places, there are public hearings before any maps are drawn, and groups and individuals are talking about their communities and why they need to be kept together. Would this type of testimony be considered lobbying? And I would say probably not. If you're talking about why different what a different community of interest is, how they're been defined in your particular community, probably not. If you get to and so there are probably lots of ways you could talk about the community and what you think, what sort of how the current maps have worked and what that process is. if you then get specific enough and you say, all right, these are, we've identified these communities, we need them all to be protected, then it may get specific enough. But in general, I think if you're talking about various communities of interest and why they're important, I would say, particularly before any maps are drawn, that probably is not lobbying. Would you agree, Natalie?
I think I would probably agree with that as well. Yeah, it's more about that general discussion of what's fair and about protecting certain groups as opposed to making specific legislative proposals about how that should be done. So I would agree with that as well. So that's, our kind of discussion about what qualifies as lobbying. When we've been talking about these definitions, we're really talking about the tax code, right? So what goes against your organization's lobbying limits if you are a 501c3, or perhaps what could qualify as one of your primary purpose activities if you happen to be a C4, C5, C6, that can do an unlimited amount of lobbying. But I did want to mention before we move on to kind of the election discussion that your state and local lobbying disclosure laws are also going to be relevant, and you should pay attention to those too. But the definitions of what qualifies as lobbying under each state's law, under each major city's law, under each county's law, perhaps, are going to be very different than the ones that we were just discussing. So do know that local and state lobbying disclosure laws generally are not going to limit how much lobbying you are allowed to do as a 501c3, 501c4, for example, but they might require lobbyist registration and reporting in some instances. That burden to register and report could fall on the individual who works for the nonprofit, or it could fall on the nonprofit itself, or potentially both. Varies from state to state. And states and of course local municipalities often define lobbying very differently, and some might even require registration and reporting of lobbyists for those who engage in administrative or commission-based advocacy and never engage in any sort of legislative advocacy. So just be aware of that. We do on our website, boulderadvocacy.org, have state law resources for many states. So if you're curious about a particular state and their lobbyist registration and reporting rules, feel free to check those out. Maybe reach out to our technical assistance hotline and we can see if we have a resource for you. But that's kind of wraps up our discussion of the lobbying considerations here. The next thing we need to talk about, because redistricting really is particularly relevant in the election game, right? In the election scheme, we have to talk about what it means to be nonpartisan. Why? Because 501c3 public charities have to remain nonpartisan at all points in time, which means they are not allowed to support or oppose candidates for public office, including candidates who might not be affiliated with political parties. So in some states, in some local jurisdictions, you might have something like here in Texas with our city council elections, where candidates don't declare a party affiliation, they just run neutrally. But that still counts too, because it is a public office. They are elected to those positions. And so as a 501c3, you can't express support or opposition for those candidates, and everything you have to do has to be nonpartisan. Again, C4s can do some partisan work as long as it's a secondary activity, but C3s really have to stick to this rule that they engage in nonpartisan advocacy only. And that rule applies universally. So it doesn't just apply to you having a conversation with someone else. It also applies to your social media communications, your verbal communications, your print communications, online communications. So make sure that anyone on staff who is in a position to speak on behalf of your organization understands these rules, because again, you've got to make sure that everything you do, if you're a 501c3 public charity, stays to that nonpartisan advocacy work. So that's the general rule. How do we figure out if something is partisan or nonpartisan? In other words, if it's impermissible or permissible? The kind of frustrating thing is that the IRS uses what's called a facts and circumstances test. So they're going to look at all the facts and circumstances around an activity, around a communication, to figure out whether it was intended to influence the outcome of candidate elections or whether it truly is neutral, nonpartisan activity. And so there's oftentimes not going to be a clear black and white answer as to whether something is permissible or impermissible. I would say, there's the exception that, obviously if your C3 came out and endorsed a particular candidate, that's a clear violation of the 501c3 rules. Other end of the spectrum, if a C3 came out and just said, hey, it's important to vote, but didn't take any issue positions, didn't take any policy positions, didn't talk about who to vote for, who the candidates are, that's clearly permissible. But everything in between kind of falls on this spectrum of risk and slides up and down this scale with different shades of gray. And so we always have to look at the facts and the circumstances. So when we're talking about redistricting in particular, some good facts, in other words, facts that would seem to indicate that your work is nonpartisan, would be communications that don't make reference to candidates or to political parties. So you're not talking about what's going to benefit the Democrats versus what's going to benefit the Republicans, that type of thing. Working to preserve fairness and communities of interest. So just talking about fairness and making sure that community of interest are held together, that's probably going to be a good fact, because it's not really talking about the outcome of elections or the candidates who might be running. Following existing political subdivisions or natural boundaries, that would be, for example, there's a river that divides this part of the city from this part of the city. That's a good boundary. And that's a neutral, nonpartisan reason for picking that boundary, right? It's because it's an actual geographical boundary as opposed to some arbitrarily designed line. And then, of course, advocating for compact and contiguous districts. That could be done in a nonpartisan way. Now, some facts on the bad side, some facts that might indicate that you have more of a partisan objective to your work would be, for example, suggesting boundaries that help protect incumbents. So you say something like, we need to keep these boundaries because otherwise these districts could flip. That would be indicating that your real objective is to influence the outcome of candidate elections. So that would not be a good fact for a 501c3. Similar to that, advocating for boundaries that are designed to flip seats. That's not something that is permissible for a 501c3 public charity. Might be permissible for a C4 in a limited quantity. Working to advance the interests of a specific political party. So for example, pushing for boundaries that unite voters around progressive issues. That could be problematic for a C3. But again, what you can see here is that these facts and circumstances really do matter. And so when we look at a communication, oftentimes we're going to have to weigh a lot of different factors to figure out whether it's a permissible communication or whether it's an impermissible one, whether the motive is purely neutral and nonpartisan, or whether the motive really is to influence the outcome of the candidate elections. So that's what the IRS uses if they think there might be a violation. What it really boils down, though, on an organizational level is your organization needs to figure out what its risk tolerance is. And sometimes you'll see C3s say things that me as a nonprofit leader, I might cringe at because I think it's way too risky and I'm very risk averse. Other C3s might not be as risk averse. So don't assume that just because someone else says it, that it's okay for you as an organization. Always weigh those facts and circumstances and be very clear about what your organization's personal risk tolerance is. Again, 501c4s can do a lot more than 501c3s because they are allowed to support or oppose candidates for public office. They can engage in partisan electioneering as long as it's a secondary activity of the organization and not the primary. Now, that doesn't mean that they're allowed to make candidate contributions, right? Under federal law, nonprofit corporations can't make contributions to candidates, and that applies in most states as well. Most states have adopted that as law too, but I think there might be a handful that haven't. But so don't think you can coordinate with candidates. Don't think that you can, as a C4, make contributions to candidates. But you can do some independent expenditures, and you could do some partisan political activity as long as it's a secondary activity of the organization and not the primary activity.
Natalie, before we move on, I have a few questions that came in about sort of how we balance these facts and circumstances and think about what's political. So one is, so what if one party dominates the process and you note that in your communications? For instance, in Illinois, all Dems voted for maps, their supermajority created. All Republicans voted against it. That's a fact. Can a C3 talk about it that way?
I think it depends on a lot of other facts, right? I mean, I think we'd have to have a more in-depth discussion about what was said. Generally speaking, it can be okay to point out how different parties think about different issues, right? but you're not supposed to be supporting or opposing candidates. And so, if your organization's history has been to, kind of always side with the Democrats on progressive issues, or maybe it's the opposite. But if you can tie your organization's history, comments that it's made about certain issues to that work, and based on the perception, it becomes clear that you are supporting the Democrats and you are hoping that the maps fall in a position where they can maintain that supermajority, then that's probably going to be problematic for a 501c3. But I think we'd probably really have to dig into the facts and circumstances. What are you thinking, Abby?
I think so. I think we need to know a little bit more context, that there are times, and there are times that we have put out statements where we talk about all Republicans voted against this nominee, judicial nominee, or all Republicans have voted against this particular bill. And it's being done for our lobbying purposes. And so again, we would need to know what other words, what the communication is, more than just talking about the Dems or the Republicans. Is the goal to get people to weigh in with their legislators and get them to change or how they're going to vote on the maps? Or is it to highlight, oh, these Republicans or these Democrats, don't really care about us. Let's make sure we think about it at the ballot box when we go back to vote. And so I think that context is important in terms of, are we talking about the party because of how we want people to vote for them? Or are we talking about the party as a way to identify people we want the public to be communicating with during the process? So again, and I know it can get frustrating when we often say it depends, but it's the nature of these rules,
and that's
and the lack of guidance from the IRS.
Yeah, and that's the type of thing too that I would recommend that people, if you have a specific question about, maybe there's a communication that you want to put out or you're thinking about putting out, call our technical assistance hotline. And although we can't be your lawyer, we can kind of, based on looking at the communication, based on conversations, based on looking at your organization's website, we can help you to identify some good facts and some bad facts, so that you then have kind of a better a way to weigh those factors, at least think about those factors. But it is so fact intensive that I think it oftentimes becomes difficult, and oftentimes there's not a clear black or white answer. And I think with that example probably falls somewhere in the shades of gray in between.
And I think it's important too of how even internally you're talking about these kinds of issues. And so are you talking about the parties because you want to support one of the parties, you want to make sure they can stay in power or they can take power? Or are you talking about it because of how a particular vote may go? And so just thinking about that is important. And so another question that came in, Natalie, is, so a lot of groups are really focused on drawing equitable and wanting equitable maps, and, often defined as giving BIPOC communities the opportunity to elect people from their communities. How, if we were to draw a map because we want to be, if it could a C3 draw a map and say, we want to map, if a C3 drew a map and said, we want our leaders to look more like the people in the community, that I think could be okay from a C3, particularly if you're talking about, we want the district to be representative of the people who live in it. I think that could be C3 permissible. On the other hand, I'm less comfortable and would love your thoughts on it if we said, we're primarily Latina community. We want to make sure we can have a Latina represent this district. What are your thoughts on that and being that explicit?
I agree. And I also think it kind of reminds me of discussions that we've had with a lot of groups about targeting GOTV work. So we oftentimes talk about, like, if you're going to try to get out the vote, like to mobilize voters in a certain area, if you're a C3, you need a neutral, nonpartisan reason for targeting that area. So a neutral, nonpartisan reason for targeting a specific area could be because it has historically low voter turnout, versus a reason like you think more people in that area are the people in that area are more likely to vote Democrat. That would be a partisan reason for targeting. So you have to identify what your neutral, nonpartisan reason for targeting an area is. I think this is almost similar. So saying that you want communities of color or BIPOC communities to be fairly represented so that they have the opportunity to elect someone who is actually a member of their community. I think that, could be a neutral, nonpartisan reason for drawing lines in a certain way. But if through your language you suggest who you want to get elected, or if it becomes clear that you want to draw those lines because you think that those communities are more likely to vote, one direction or the other, that's when you get into something that's problematic. So that's another, key thing with this election stuff too, is that you want to have good documentation of your neutral, nonpartisan reasons so that if you ever do get questions, you can say, no, we didn't do this because we're trying to flip a seat or to, make this go to a different party or to hold on to the current party. We did this because these are the constituents that our organizations represents, and we just want to make sure that they have power as a voting bloc. So I think those are different things. So with that, we'll go to our next agenda point. Private foundation funding. We're only going to mention this briefly because I want to have time for these scenarios, but a lot of questions that we often get are related to grant agreements and to funding rules effectively, because if you start reading through your private foundation grants in particular, you'll notice that there are all sorts of little restrictions in there. And of course, those are contracts. So you've got to abide by the terms of the contract. So in the redistricting process, a couple things you want to think about is whether, of course, your redistricting process involves a legislative or a lobbying component. The reason I say that is because private foundations, rules are different for public foundations, but private foundations are not allowed to earmark grant funds for lobbying, which means they can't make you a grant that's specifically for you to lobby. They could potentially give you a general support grant, which you could use for anything, or they could fund the non-lobbying portion of a specific project grant, but they're not supposed to earmark funds for lobbying. Because of that rule, a lot of private foundations include language in their grant agreements that seems to indicate that you're not allowed to use the funds for lobbying. But look at that language carefully, because if the grant says that the grant is not earmarked for lobbying, that's the private foundation protecting itself from an excise tax for earmarking grants for lobbying. That's different than saying that the grant funds are prohibited from being used for lobbying. So look carefully, because if you're wanting to use private foundation grant funds and your state does have a legislative redistricting process, then you need to make sure that those funds are unrestricted. You also need to make sure when applying for grants and when receiving grants that you're clear whether it is a general support or a specific project grant, because again, general support grants, as long as the language of the grant agreement allows it, you can use those for any purposes, including lobbying purposes. But the one thing that you're of course going to be prohibited from using a private foundation grant for, and this would apply to C4s as well, is you are not allowed to use any private foundation or public foundation grants for partisan political purposes, because they are another type of 501c3. And so those rules against partisan electioneering apply to them as well. But Abby, we were talking a little bit earlier, I think, about project grants, and when someone gets a grant and they want to report back to their funder, should they be talking about the work that they're doing in the redistricting process, especially if it's legislative? Should they ignore that? Should they skirt over it? How can they talk about their work when they're talking with their funders?
So that's a great question. And another one of, well, it depends. The best scenario is that you have a really good relationship with your program officer, and you can ask them sort of how much detail they want in a grant report. And we all know that every foundation is different and has different requirements and different preferences. And some foundations, if they give you a general support grant, love to hear all about the lobbying that you did. Some foundations don't want to hear about it at all. So if you know what the particular foundation wants, make sure you stick to their rules. And particularly if a foundation says, don't tell us at all about lobbying, don't tell them about lobbying, because you may then wind up having to redo your report. We've all been there. But if you don't know, I think you can think about, one, what was your what were you funded to do? But I think you also want to be clear. if you don't have real guidance from the foundation, one, you want to think about, are you reporting back on how you use that particular foundation's funding? Or are you reporting on the project that the foundation funded? And that may seem like the same thing, but they could be very different. So it could be that you got a grant to go towards redistricting, to support your redistricting work. In that case, you may talk about all of the redistricting you did, some of which was maybe funded by that one particular foundation, and maybe you use some of your general support dollars, or you use some of your bake sale money to fund some of it. In that case, you may feel comfortable talking about all of the work that you did, some of which might have been lobbying, some of which may not have been lobbying. On the other hand, you may be asked to report how you spent the Foundation A's dollars. And so you may be reporting on just a small segment of the redistricting work that you did. So you may have done a lot of other work that you paid for with by other foundations with your bake sale funds, but this foundation only wants to know about what their money did. So, again, theoretically, it's okay for foundations to hear about what you've done, as long as it's all C3 permissible, so there's no partisan political activity. So if you're not sure, maybe a default is that you think about talking about the redistricting work you did in general. And then from there, if the foundations want to know just more of a smaller slice, or if you know that they don't want you to tell them about any of the lobbying, then you can start sort of segmenting it. And again, we're happy to talk with you more about that. We're happy to sort of look with you at grant agreements, to look at your specific activities, and to really think about how you can talk about this work in a way that is permissible. And as Natalie was talking about in her last example, the language really matters. And so, sometimes it's thinking that there are lots of ways you can describe what you're doing, that we could help you craft one that may be the most C3 friendly.
So that's a little bit about funding for our redistricting work, but now we want to talk through some specific scenarios that we've all come up with to figure out, is this something a C3 can participate in? Is it something a C4 can participate in? What are the considerations? And so we are going to kind of walk through these. We have 4 different scenarios. The first scenario says a state has 2 coalitions of progressive groups, one that is led by unions and is very engaged in C4, C5, C6 style activities, including drawing lines to enable more Democrats to win seats, and one that is led by nonprofits, we'll call them public charities for legal terms, that's focused more on redistricting education and the drawing of fair districts. Your organization has been asked to join both. Can you join those coalition meetings? And so kind of thinking about that, I will say that, kind of the general rule when we talk about coalition work is that your tax exempt status as an organization will follow you into your coalition work. So if you are a 501c3 public charity, it's not probably going to be appropriate for you to join a coalition that has C4, C5s, and C6s, but more specifically a coalition that is focused on drawing lines to protect or to advance one political party's agenda and their candidates. That's not to say that, all coalitions with C4s and C5s and C6s are going to be off limits for C3s, because if there is a truly nonpartisan coalition that's united against, maybe around one issue area. So Texas, SB 8, the abortion ban. Maybe you have a coalition that's really just focused on how to attack that law in a nonpartisan way, then that's going to be okay for a C3 to join. But if it's a C4, C5, C6 coalition that's trying to draw partisan districts or trying to draw districts in a partisan way, then a C3 is not going to want to join that coalition. Now, another nonprofit coalition that really is just focused on drawing fair districts, but they don't have a partisan agenda, they're not searching for a particular partisan outcome, that's probably going to be okay. Abby, would you agree with that?
I would agree. And I would, also say, there may be times when it may be appropriate, or, it may make sense for a C3 to go to a particular meeting or a particular event of the first coalition. Just because even though the C4 coalition-led coalition or the union-led coalition mostly is, most of their activities may be drawing lines to enable more Democrats to win seats. They may have certain activities or certain meetings or certain speakers that may not be partisan. And so there may be times when there can be, a C3 could join or go to a particular meeting, but I think it could be risky, particularly if the C3's name is sort of listed as a coalition member, where it looks like the C3, or people would presume, and we all know, that you shouldn't presume or assume, but, if the C3's name, it looks like the C3 is actively part of that first coalition, making decisions about it, that could be problematic for the C3.
Yep, and it looks like Deborah hit the nail on the head, but probably not problematic for the C3 to join the second coalition. You just don't want to be perceived as a C3 of supporting partisan political objectives. And so that's what you are ultimately trying to avoid.
And I would say, if just to dig into this, this is sort of an obvious one. Sometimes you may be asked, you're a C3, and you may be asked to join a coalition. And sometimes you're not sure whether it's a coalition led by unions and C4s, whether it's C3s. Sometimes you may be asked by someone who wears multiple hats and may work for a C3, C4, and even a political organization. And so sometimes it's important to ask those questions. We get asked to participate in lots of coalitions or to sponsor lots of events. And I'm usually the one going, well, who else is involved? Is this a C3 or C4? And so asking those questions is important up front. And just because a coalition may be led by unions or C4s doesn't mean it's off the table for C3s. There could be coalitions very active by unions and C4s that are doing C3 friendly work. And so in this case, the real crux of this is where their activities are drawing lines to enable more Democrats to win seats. So just because, a C4's in the mix or unions in the mix doesn't mean it's not C3 friendly. That's when you just have to ask more questions.
Absolutely. So our second scenario here, we have a local Democratic club, and they want to learn more about the upcoming redistricting process. And they actually called Abby. And they said, hey, Abby, would you be willing to present and possibly look for ways to collaborate with us? Abby, at that point, what questions do you have for them? What are you gonna ask them to figure out if this is going to be a C3 permissible activity that you as a representative of your C3 can engage in?
Well, I guess in some way, I want to know more about what they want me to talk about. Because I would guess that if I'm a C3, I could talk to sort of others about what I think is important and provide educational information and share C3 ways for people to get involved. I guess I would want to know whether my organization has done this kind of thing before, or whether we have a program where we speak to groups, if we've never, are we only speaking to, would we agree to speak to this Democratic club, but if a Republican club called and asked us for information, would we automatically, hang up and lose the message? And so in some way, I guess it would be less I would want to know from the club and more about my organization's policies, practices, and then thinking about, ways to collaborate that they could, if we're doing a C3 event, I guess they could participate, their members could join with us, but we would need to be careful participating in an activity that they created that may be partisan.
So that could be something, if your organization has a history of providing redistricting training, for example, about, how maps can be drawn fairly, about how the process works in your particular state, and you go to all different types of groups and you present that type of information through educational events, and this is just another group that's wanting that same training that you give to everyone else, then, maybe this is going to be okay. But I think, again, this is something where we'd probably have to look at a lot more facts, a lot more circumstances to figure out, what the organization's history with this type of work is, and what the motives are of the group that's inviting them. The other, question I would have is, is this a campaign event, or is this really a kind of an educational event? Like, are they going to also be introducing who their slate of candidates is coming up, that type of thing, because those perception issues could get really dicey.
And I guess one other factor may be how public the event is, or how they're planning to publicize it. Are they going to talk about that our group is, so just thinking about how they'll publicize it.
Yeah, so lots of different facts and circumstances that would go into this scenario. So scenario 3, this is the fun one where you get a call from a reporter. And always make sure that you pick a person in your organization who is charged with having these types of conversations so that they understand what the rules are and what can be said. But you get a call from a reporter who's doing a story about how the majority party is running the redistricting process. You think they're doing a lousy job of making the hearings inclusive of community voices. What issues do you need to be concerned about? And again, this is where that facts and circumstances analysis comes in. I think my initial thought is that, it is potentially you can comment on this and you can make some statements about the need for fairness, about the need to keep certain types of communities, keep their voices together. You could talk about how the process works, how the process could work better. I think where you run a risk is if you start commenting about how the majority party is ruining things. If you start kind of following the reporter's lead and start talking about how, the majority party does control this process and they're the ones making it unfair, because now all of a sudden it's kind of, you're critiquing individuals who are on a certain side of the aisle. And especially if you bring in language about the elections and, voters should remember that these types of activities are happening when they go to the polls next November, that would clearly be a red flag for a C3. So I think this is the type of thing where you would just want to be really careful about what you said, about how the reporter characterizes you. You might even consider one thing. I'd be curious if you would agree with this, Abby, but maybe even throwing in a disclaimer, and who knows if the reporter runs it, but reminding the reporter that you're a C3, you don't support or oppose candidates, but you're happy to comment on the process, that type of thing.
Absolutely. I always love disclaimers. But why don't we're starting to get towards the end of the time, which is amazing how fast time goes. So why don't we go through the next scenario and then see what other questions we have?
Perfect. So start dropping your questions in the chat box. I know people have been doing that already, but we'll go through one more scenario. Abby, would love your comments on this. You have a coalition that's done an evaluation of a draft map, and it identifies both an incumbency protection issue and an unfair partisan advantage issue. Are there restrictions on how a C3 can talk about these two problems? What do you think?
Well, of course, you would not make this simple enough. I think the C3 could talk about the. Oh no, actually, C3 needs. Can raise the issues. They don't want to promote them, but so.
I think this one gets real gray.
Yeah.
Very complicated, personally. I think as soon as you start talking about partisan advantages and potentially how they are, protecting, safe districts for a particular party, I think as soon as you kind of start delving into that, you're necessarily going to be incurring some risk. That would be my take on it.
Yeah.
But I think this very easily could be one where if you talk to 3 different lawyers, they might all 3 give you different answers, because I think it's a very dicey one. My C3 in my hypothetical world that's very risk averse would probably run.
So is this an example where if an organization wants to address this, one of the tips would be have on record for you to refer back to that says why you're talking about this and why it relates to you as a C3 that it's appropriate for you to talk about it.
Yeah, and it might even be one, this is the type that, if I were talking to a group who really wanted to comment on this, I would even go so far as to recommend that they, go to in-house counsel or external counsel just to get a quick letter opinion that says that, this is something that's okay just to have in the file, just in case, right?
And it would also be good to have disclaimers are our friend, and to talk about why why a C3 is, commenting on it. And then thinking about how you use it and whether it's something that you put out, publicly, whether you then share it with the Democratic Party or particular legislators of one party, so all of those facts and circumstances would come into play into thinking about what is that you've identified, and what was your goal going into identifying the draft map. Were you looking specifically for these 2 issues? Did you happen to find these? What else is your organization doing? So I think again, looking at who you're talking to, in some way, what else the organization is also doing.
And I think it might be even, and I'd be curious what you thought about this, Abby, but like if you somehow, you get this question and you've identified these issues, but instead of kind of identifying them in this way, the way it's written on this particular page, maybe you say a more general statement about how, drawing lines shouldn't be about protecting parties. It shouldn't be about, who is going to get elected. It really should be about preserving community voices and making sure that every voter has an equal voice in the political process. I mean, I think there are ways you can still talk about this without being so pointed as to say, this is, the GOP is trying to do this and that's clearly wrong, that type
Absolutely.
of. So I think there, again, those facts and circumstances are gonna weigh in. But, with that, those were our 4 kind of hypothetical scenarios that we came up with in advance, and kind of a good demonstration of how gray things can get in this particular space. But we wanted to open it up to you all. So does anyone have any questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat if you do, or perhaps.
Oh wait, Natalie, I think there's another question that came in earlier that I was waiting towards the end. And so so one sort of a great question is calling on, so you've talked about, that if you're calling on legislators and weighing in with legislators, it may be lobbying. But what about if we're calling on legislators to hold more opportunities for public input?
I don't think that, unless you are asking them to do something in regards to a particular piece of legislation, I don't think that is really going to qualify. Asking them to allow the public to voice their concerns. That's not, expressing a view on a specific piece of legislation. That's not saying which way the public should argue in regards to a new law. It's just saying that, you need to take the time to listen to what your constituents are saying, which I think is a different message. So I would be comfortable probably not putting that into the lobbying category, unless having more hearings required a change to the law, right? So like if you were in some weird state or some situation where, the number of hearings per each thing is predetermined by laws that already exist, and you're saying we need to create another one, which would require the passage of a new law to get there, which I don't think would really happen. But yeah, I think in most instances that's not going to be lobbying. Anyone else?
I think I've gotten all the questions I've been typed in.
All right.
And
I
again,
have a quick question.
Yeah.
So it was asked earlier on in the chat, but for states that have like Democratic trifectas, there may be there's clearly a majority there. Should a C3 be showing the emphasis of communicating both with Democratic and Republican legislators to show kind of like that evenness, or does that not matter?
I think it does and does not. I mean, like if you're, let's say
How's
that,
that an answer for you?
yeah, I mean, I think we talk about oftentimes educating legislators. We'll oftentimes do election specific webinars, and you can educate legislators about what your organization stands for, about the issues that it works on. But if you, if those legislators are candidates, it gets a little bit weirder because you want to make sure to give it equally to all, right? You don't want to give one party an unfair advantage. So you don't want to arm, the Democratic candidates with information that you're not arming the Republicans with, because then that could look, potentially unfair. But that's usually in the candidate context, not in the communicating with legislators context, which is a fine line, but it's a definite line. So I think if you're in a state and the House and the Senate and the governor are all on the same side, and you're dealing with a legislative process and you're trying to get boundaries drawn in a certain way, I think it's why you want those boundaries drawn in a certain way that's more relevant than who you're communicating to. I mean, you don't have to waste your time, in my opinion, trying to reach out to everyone just to, unless it's going to give one party an unfair advantage, unless your motivation is to, preserve certain lines in a partisan way. But I don't, I think you've got to look at kind of what your situation is. And when you're trying to get legislation passed, whether it's redistricting related or some other issue, you're going to target the people who you think you can persuade, right? You don't want to waste your time on unpersuadables.
And I would say, I think there's also a difference if you're reaching out to legislators and the legislative leaders or the minority caucus, trying to get them, where there may be position for them to move or try to stop the maps or change the maps, would be very different than weighing in with the state, with the state party caucus or the state, the Democratic Senate campaign committee or some of those arms that are all about the party. And so, and sometimes that's really clear, sometimes it's not. But again, thinking about why are you reaching out to these people? Is it in their legislative role? That is there a legislative ask you're making? That's usually safer.
Yeah, than if you're trying to arm candidates or trying to influence the outcome of the elections. Yeah. Anyone else? We've probably got time for one more question, if anyone has one. And I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide just so that we can give people a chance here. But I wanted to put this up just kind of in the background while we're finishing our discussion, because that 866 number at the bottom is our technical assistance hotline, and that advocacy@afj.org is technical assistance as well. So if you come up with anything after, you can direct it there. But I'm not seeing any additional questions.
So Erin, do you want the last word?
Well, one thing that I do think would be good for you to address is that a lot of states are starting to move or starting to think about when the commission, the legislative body, or whoever the governing body is coming out with the draft map. They're starting to do analysis of those draft maps to both look at it and go, did this map actually take in our testimony and our public comments or not? So the question there is that, to me, that is just an analysis of whether or not they actually took your feedback in or not. And then the second way that states are starting to think about evaluating maps are also through an equity lens. Are these maps really racial equity maps? Do they really give BIPOC communities the opportunity to elect people from their communities. My question there is, if you do the analysis and you share it with the media that feels like it's not lobbying, when does it start getting into a lobbying point after you do the analysis?
So that's a great question. And I would say, if for groups that have used the 501h expenditure test, it's, that I would say that's clearly not lobbying. And to do an analysis of the maps and whether they've taken your comments into consideration, even whether they've used an equity lens and whether you have a chart with checks and minuses or smiley faces, and you're looking at this and talking about whether this is a good map or a bad map, even that, going that far, I would say would not, if you're sending that analysis out to the media using the 501h expenditure test, that would not be lobbying unless and until you put the call to action on it, where you say, so call your legislators and tell them to
Pose this map or
to kill this map, tell them to, you go forward with this map or tweak this map. I would say that's not lobbying. For groups using the insubstantial part test, it's a much harder decision. And I think there it could be seen as, if you're commenting on sort of a particular map that the legislatures come out with, and you're commenting on whether whether they're, it may depend on whether you're saying it included what we, it is, the definition of lobbying is, are you expressing a view about specific legislation? So if you're saying it included what we want, could that be seen as expressing a view about specific legislation? And I would say probably we might be able to make an argument depending on how it's worded that it's not. But I think, again, for groups that are using the 501h expenditure test, and why we are at Boulder Advocacy such fans of it, is because you can say so much more without having to consider it as lobbying. And so I think in your scenario, both weighing in on the analysis of whether they included your suggestions, your recommendations, whether it has an equality lens to it, I would say very likely there are ways that it would not be lobbying for 501h electors.
Great. Well, thank you. And then I want to, I know people might have additional questions for Abby and Natalie. And so I just wanted to talk about next steps, which is I will be sending out probably tomorrow or Monday to everyone who RSVP'd a copy of the recording of this training, as well as all the different resources that Abby, Natalie, and Ryan were putting into the chat for people to refer back to. And as a reminder, if you as an individual have a question, Boulder Advocacy has an amazing technical assistant line that you can call and talk to a lawyer. As a former executive director, I used it often and found it very useful as I started thinking about how I might want to frame the campaigns that we're working on and how we might want to think about it as lobbying or not lobbying. So thank you everyone so much for being part of this call, asking really thoughtful questions. Abby and Natalie, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And again, if you have more questions, you can always refer back to the technical assistance line to be able to ask questions. So thank you everyone so much.
Thank you. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.